Hi, and welcome to Social Cognition number 3. This time we're going to talk about heuristics and biases. In particular, what we are going to speak about today is the following. First, we'll do some definition work, so we'll try to agree on what we mean when we talk about cognitive heuristics and biases. We'll talk a little bit about what's good about thinking in heuristics and biases, and we'll talk a little bit about disadvantages that this mode of thinking sort of brings with it. And then we'll jump into 3 very prominent heuristics and look at these in detail. So we'll speak about the representativeness heuristic, the availability heuristic, and the anchoring heuristic. And lastly, we'll also speak a little bit about prospect theory. So that's the plan for this session of social cognition, and let's just jump right in. So if you remember from our first video, I think that must have been the first session, we spoke a little bit about the background of social cognition that you can see against the history of what people have theorized about how people make choices, right? How people think about the world. And one way of thinking about the world is basically the Homo economicus view, or assuming that people are rational decision makers and people are capable of looking at their environment and rationally perceiving it. And what do we mean by that? We mean that people are rational, they maximize their own utility, as in they do what's best for them. They're objective, so they're relatively free from emotion. And this view would also suggest that people are logical, so free from cognitive processing errors or biases. And in particular, this last, In particular, this last cog in the wheel, no. In particular, this last aspect about the rational decision maker, the logical perspective, that's what we are going to take a shot at more closely today. So I've also shown you this factoid before, so introducing the idea that indeed there is something like human error, or people aren't actually perfectly rational, and they also aren't really quite logical in how they tend to make their choices, at least if we take a look at it through the perspective of what should you do in order to maximize your own outcomes. So this is the example that we've spoken about briefly before. So the idea that if we were all rational, then none of us should be smoking. None of us should be using any drugs where there's a risk that we get hooked on them, that we get dependent. That goes for alcohol and any other drugs. No one should be doing any risky sexual behavior. We should all be exercising a lot in a healthy way, and still people don't do that. And instead, this number at least suggests that some 50% of deaths in the US between the ages of 15 and 64 are actually due to some type of bad personal decisions. So it seems like people aren't necessarily great at making rational choices. And this would be, this would lead us to the idea of looking at how then do people make decisions. And this is where cognitive biases and heuristics come in. Now, I do have another example to show you, namely optical illusions. But for this, I would like to ask you if you're not okay with viewing optical illusions or flashing lights or these kinds of things, please skip ahead. Skip all the yellow slides, and then you can join us after these examples for visual illusions. Now, I'm sure that many of you are familiar with visual illusions. So, for instance, the Hermann grid, as I've printed it down here. And Fiedler et al., they make the point that using heuristics is kind of similar to using visual illusions. So they suggest that for visual illusions, we have these because there are some perceptual errors that make us see things that aren't really there. So in this case of the Hermann grid, I'm sure many of you see the image switching between white points and black points in between the crossings, while indeed all of the points are white. So we're seeing black points, although they're not really there. The idea is that we can rely on context cues to make sense of our environment. But depending on how it's set up, we make mistakes. And that is also the case for not just for visual illusions, but also for the way we make decisions in our environment. And just because this is fun, I brought another example for visual illusions here is sky's oblique grating, and I think this one is interesting because it looks like as if the lines, the horizontal lines, were actually a little bit slanted in different directions, right? But if we remove these small black and white quadrants, then you can see that the lines already move to a much more horizontal and a less slanted way. Now, I'm not sure, but some of you might have seen this one, a visual illusion where there's a bunch of coffee beans, and your task is to find the face. So there is one human face in there, and I challenge you to just pause the video real quickly and see if you can find the face. But also, I bet you can't unsee it once you've discovered it. And this is actually an entry to a Photoshop contest, and not a classical visual illusion, but I think it goes to add to our point. Now, similarly to these visual illusions, we could say that the way we make decisions in our environment is also not quite rational, and we are people not quite so economicus. Because our choices are not quite rational, we maximize utility or some other things. Sometimes we try to be consistent, for instance. We're not quite objective in the way that we interact with our environment, right? Because we definitely have emotions. But we're not super logical either, because we do definitely make some cognitive processing errors. And these then can lead to biases. So similarly to visual illusions, they're just cognitive errors we make, and these then lead to biases. Right. Now, what I'd like you to do is pause the video for a moment and try to think of some examples for behavior that is not quite rational. See if you can come up with some examples. Now, after you've given these examples, you will see that there's a bunch of examples for behaviors that we display that aren't really exactly rational. And I want to introduce you to the concept of bounded rationality now. So this is the idea that even though our behavior is not necessarily completely rational, it is also not completely random or unsystematic, right? Yes, granted, sometimes we do things that seem random and that seem to make no sense, but if we look more closely, we can often try to make some sense of these behaviors. And that is also the case for behaviors that are not quite rational. But indeed, what we can find is that within the parameters in which our behavior is situated, so within the time that we have available, the effort that we're capable of investing, and the resources that we have available to think something through, these parameters, they bind they basically constrain how much capacity we have to process information. And depending on how much capacity we have to process information, whether or not we will make a choice, at least that's what bounded rationality argues, that is rational, depends on these. I didn't like this. Now that you have created some examples of behavior that's not quite rational, I want to introduce you to the idea or the concept of bounded rationality. So if you think about it, the examples that you've given is probably the case that in many simple decision problems, we can kind of manage to make some rational choices, or like our choices are pretty okay from the perspective of rationality. But as soon as it becomes more complicated, so my guess would be the behaviors that you've described as examples are actually in quite complicated situations. As soon as it gets more complicated and more difficult situations, we kind of have to sacrifice something, and we can't make the perfect or rational, as it were, decision. And in these not quite rational decisions, it's still not the case that behavior is completely random or unsystematic, right? There is some sense to how people make these types of not quite rational decisions. And bounded rationality argues that within the parameters of a decision process, so kind of the bounding constraints, like time or effort that we are willing to invest, or the resources that we have available to make a certain choice that leads up to a specific behavior. Well, this means that because of these parameters, our behavior is kind of bounded. And one of the important parameters that bound how rational our behavior can be is our cognitive capacity to process information. So if we had a supercomputer built into our brain, perhaps we could make perfectly rational decisions all the time. But because we don't, our cognitive capacity is the boundary condition for how rational our behavior can be. So that means our behavior can be rational to a certain degree, and then in a way we would say it's quasi-rational. So, but the idea that there's a limit to our cognitive processing capacity, and this is the reason why we can't always produce rational choices, well, that's why rational choice theories couldn't quite predict behavior so well. They assume that we can make massively complicated computations, and often we just don't engage in these computations, but rather we just have some cognitive shortcuts or other ways to simplify the decision problem. And we might even be very good at doing that, right? We might even take shortcuts that are actually helpful and that help us save cognitive capacity or operate within the cognitive capacity that we've available, and get to a choice more quickly than taking the actual long route of doing the perfectly rational computations. So, and a lot of psychology deals with finding out how these cognitive shortcuts work. So the main idea here is that we have capacity constraints in our processing capabilities. So while our brain is actually pretty impressive in what it can pull off, it doesn't take the full route that you would need a literal supercomputer for to do every single time for every single tiny behavior that we do. But instead, we sometimes just basically use our little calculator to just take a shortcut. And in particular, the not quite so important behaviors we just determine quickly. Right. So this leaves us with the idea that we have a not quite rational decision maker, but still a decision maker who makes some sense, right? So and now we can take a look at theories that assume this not quite rational decision maker and then do research with it. So on the one hand, we have the approach from economics, Kahneman and Tversky. We will speak about these two researchers and their theory of how human processing works a little bit later in this installment of social cognition. And in this economics approach, the idea would be to compare actual behavior with a rational standard. So we still have the gold standard, the idea of the Homo economicus in the back of our minds, and we compare what people really do, like in the wild, in the real world. What people really do, we can compare this with the rational standard we still are interested in. And then if we do this comparison, then biases kind of fall out of these comparisons as innate errors in decision making caused by our lack of rationality or by our processing constraints. And similarly, the fast and frugal approach also deals with the idea that there are not quite rational decision makers. And this approach actually emphasizes that these simple shortcuts that sometimes our brain takes, we call these heuristics. And the idea here is that simple heuristics make us smart. So Gigerenzer, this is a researcher who's very prominent in this approach, would argue that heuristics are a part of our adaptive toolbox that can sometimes solve problems better even than the rational approach. Right. So bounded rationality seems like a concept that's really helpful for us, but well, there's kind of one problem with doing research about bounded rationality, right? Because there's only one way to be strictly rational, yet there are so many ways to be quasi-rational. So whenever we basically test our one single way of being rational against quasi-rational strategies, the rational model kind of has really bad chances because it's just one way of explaining the data. But quasi-rational strategies, we could just come up with hundreds, literally hundreds of decision strategies, or the strategies that we use to decide what we're going to do that would qualify as quasi-rational. So that's a bit of an issue we have to keep in mind. But luckily there's a way to fix this issue, which is to test against a specific quasi-rational strategy. So instead of saying, well, we will compare rational against all possible quasi-rational strategies, we can say we will compare what a rational decision maker would do with what someone would do who follows this specific quasi-rational decision strategy. Okay. And now some more defining we have to do. We've just defined bounded rationality and sort of seen what the idea behind that approach is, the idea of quasi-rational choices to carry out certain behaviors. And now we have to also define what heuristics are. And I've sort of alluded to this a bunch of times, but I want to make it really explicit as well. So we consider heuristics as cognitive shortcuts or rules of thumb, which we employ when we make judgments about our environment or when we try to decide which behavior to display. So we can talk a little bit about what's good about using heuristics and what's maybe not so great about them. So what's good about them is that these cognitive shortcuts, because they're cognitive shortcuts, they require relatively little processing effort. So they're not time consuming. They can be made really quickly and without a lot of brain power basically going into making that choice. And still, they're often sufficiently accurate, right? Because often it's good enough if you're kind of like within a certain range of the true answer. So often it's not in our daily interactions, it's not necessary to have like the point prediction to be spot on about something, but it's good enough and there's like a range where your answer would be good enough, right? So if we take that perspective, cognitive shortcuts might produce judgments and behaviors that are sufficiently accurate. Now, while that is great, there are also some disadvantages to them. So if we use these cognitive shortcuts, then we might produce systematic distortions in the way we make our judgments, and we might produce systematic distortions in the types of behavior that are at the end of our decision processes. So, and these systematic distortions, another definition for you, that's what we would call biases. And so if these biases occur, that might be a disadvantage because, well, we might not only be kind of sufficiently accurate, but we might be wrong in a certain direction most of the time. Yeah? And that could then produce consequent problems. So to illustrate some more what heuristics are, I'd like you to think about someone who's trying to catch a ball, like a ball player. When they catch a ball, how do they do it? How is it possible that humans can catch balls? Is it us really doing the calculations of the curve and the speed at which the ball is going to first be thrown and then fall, and then, gravity and stuff? Is that what we do? Or, as you can perhaps tell from my, let's say, ramblings about how to calculate the curve of a thrown ball, is this perhaps that we just focus on it and we try to estimate the curve of this ball? Well, it is the latter, right? No one sits down and does the calculations on the baseball field, for instance, before running after the ball. But in a way, you could say this is kind of a cognitive shortcut, right? So we should be doing the full calculation, but we don't, Instead, we use a heuristic for where we expect the ball to fall, and we act on it. And this would be a heuristic. Now, if I consistently underestimate and I don't run quite far enough to catch the ball, and it keeps dropping just like this far, if I had run this far further, I would have been able to catch it. Well, if I consistently do that, that would be a bias, right? I would be underestimating consistently the curve of the ball falling. All right. Okay, so now that we've defined heuristics, it's time to jump in and take a look at some specific heuristics that are quite prevalent among people.